Have you ever wondered if paradise could become a prison? Not a prison of cold iron bars and silent stone walls, but a far more sophisticated one, woven from the very fabric of prosperity, built with the mortar of peace, and locked with the key of absolute security. To understand such a paradox, let us turn our eyes to a place seemingly forgotten by time, a single, defiant speck of emerald green set against the infinite golden canvas of the great desert. Behold, the domain of Lot, an isolated kingdom, a lush oasis shielded from the scorching heat and the harsh, whipping winds. Here, life flourished with an unnatural vibrancy, a miracle of abundance bestowed in the heart of a desolate wasteland. Water, the true jewel of the desert, flowed here in plenty from an underground spring that seemed to know no end. The steady, rhythmic creak of the wooden water wheels was the oasis's heartbeat, the diligent melody of its wealth, lifting scoop after scoop of crystalline water to quench the thirst of verdant, terraced fields. Barley and dates, under the care of diligent servants and the grace of nature, grew with a fierce strength, promising harvests of impossible bounty. Further on, in carefully planned pastures, thousands of sheep and goats roamed like scattered white clouds, their thick fleece a testament to a life of plenty. And at the center of this miniature Eden, a grand villa of pale, cream-colored stone rose with an air of dignified permanence, its walls catching the sun's glare, shining like a beacon of affluence. The master of all this was Lot, the man who now stood on the highest balcony of his villa, his posture stately, his beard meticulously groomed. He was past his middle years, yet his back remained straight, and his eyes held the authority of a man long accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. But if one looked closer, one would see something else. His gaze was not lifted to the vast azure sky in gratitude, nor did it drift toward the distant horizon in contemplation. His eyes were fixed downward, sweeping across his domain. He looked upon his flocks, not seeing the beauty of creation, but a number that was multiplying. He looked upon his fields, not feeling the miracle of life, but calculating the yield of the coming harvest. His face held the deep satisfaction of a king surveying his kingdom, yet deep within his eyes lay a constant, simmering anxiety, the tension of an owner who perpetually fears loss. Lot, once known as a righteous man, had left the clamor of the world to seek a new beginning, and God had answered him by granting him this land. He had transformed it into a haven for his family, a fortress of absolute safety, sealed off from the turmoil, sin, and uncertainties of the outside world. The high walls were built not only to keep out the sand, but to keep out humanity itself. The servants within the oasis were hand-picked, families who had served Lot for years, loyal and taciturn. He had created a perfect, closed ecosystem, a miniature society under his complete control. But he failed to realize that in the safe silence of his wealth, as the initial prayers of thanksgiving faded and gave way to the calculations of profit and loss, a different kind of seed had been sown in the soil of his own soul. It was the seed of pride. It grew quietly, its roots sinking deep into his self-satisfaction, its leafy branches of indifference slowly eclipsing his heart. Now, each dawn, he no longer looked to the sun as a sacred gift from the Creator, but as a diligent laborer, an entity whose duty it was to pour light and warmth upon his assets so they might flourish. Wealth, which began as a blessing, had slowly morphed into a burden, an idol that demanded his ceaseless devotion. The question Lot should have been asking himself was not how to build the walls higher or dig the wells deeper. The true question, the one that held the key to his and his family's fate, was not whether they were safe from the world outside, but whether they were safe from the decay that was beginning to fester deep within themselves. Here, in this man-made paradise, a tragedy was quietly beginning, and its main actors, tragically, were entirely unaware. Abundance has its own voice, a seductive melody that not all can resist. At first, it is a sweet whisper of comfort, murmuring in your ear each night. Do not worry, you are safe. The storehouses are full, the The walls are strong. Nothing can harm you now. But if you listen for too long, if you allow yourself to be lulled by its gentle tune, the whisper changes its tone. It becomes more assertive, more powerful, transforming into a declaration of arrogance. You need no one. You are self-sufficient. You are the architect of your own fortune. For Lot, that whisper had become a grand, heroic symphony, drowning out every other sound in his life, including the voice of his conscience and the call of his faith. Every morning, while the dew still glistened on the blades of grass, Lot began his day. But his work was not one of physical labor. He was the brain, the calculator, the grand strategist of this empire of wealth. He would walk along the irrigation channels, not to enjoy the cool freshness of the water, but to inspect for any blockages, to ensure that not a single drop was being wasted. He would step into the vast storehouses, where the air was thick with the scent of dry grain and preserved fruits. He did not take a deep breath in gratitude for the bounty. Instead, he would plunge his calloused hand into a barrel of golden barley, feeling the grains slip through his fingers, his face betraying a profound satisfaction, the quiet glee of possession. He no longer saw himself as a steward entrusted with God's property. He had crowned himself a king, ruling over a kingdom forged by his own hands and his own mind. After his inspection, he would retreat to his study. There were no holy scrolls left open on his desk, only leather parchments covered in numbers and architectural plans. His ledger, with its meticulous entries detailing newborn livestock, milk production, and profits from wool sales, had become his most sacred text. He could sit for hours, carefully writing, calculating, and planning for the future. 30 new lambs this month, he would mutter to himself, his lips moving in intense concentration. The eastern granary is nearly full. I must order the masons to build another before the rainy season. The stone fence to the north needs reinforcing. The desert seems more aggressive lately. Every decision, every plan, revolved around two principles: protection and expansion. His prayers, when he remembered them, had also changed. They were no longer sincere conversations, humble words of thanks offered up to the Creator. They had become silent dialogues with his assets. He spoke to the numbers, to the storehouses, to the sturdy walls of his villa. Lord, he might begin out of habit, but his mind would immediately drift. Please protect my herds from disease, and guard my property from the thieves that lurk in the wilderness. Prayer had become a formal submission of requests, a list of demands in a business contract he believed he had earned through his righteous life. He was convinced that this immense wealth was the tangible proof of his own virtue, God's official seal of approval. But he had made a fatal mistake. He had confused the blessing with the purpose. A blessing is a gift. A purpose is a devotion. Lot had turned the gift into his purpose, and in doing so, had made himself a slave to it. The high wall he had so proudly built to keep out the desert and the world beyond had also become an invisible but impenetrable barrier, separating him from God and from his fellow man. If Lot was imprisoned by a self-satisfaction built from his own riches, his wife, Edith, was shackled in a different kind of cellar dungeon of fear. The very isolation that Lot had crafted, instead of bringing her the peace he intended, had perversely nurtured a monster in her soul named suspicion. For Edith, the world beyond the stone walls was no longer a place of other people, nomadic tribes, or distant cities. It had become a source of potential contagion, a cesspool of disease and crime that was constantly lurking, waiting for a chance to invade. The desert was no longer a majestic landscape of God's creation, but a hidden enemy, carrying invisible germs and malicious intentions on its sandy winds. Edith's every day was a series of rituals dictated by anxiety. She maintained the appearance of a noble, elegant lady, her clothes always immaculate and lightly perfumed, but her eyes were never still. They were constantly scanning, searching for the slightest sign of disorder. She could be walking down a long corridor and suddenly stop, running a pristine white finger over the surface of a decorative ceramic vase. If she found the smallest speck of dust, her face would tighten in displeasure, and some unfortunate servant girl would bear the brunt of her wrath. She didn't look out her window to admire the beauty of the oasis, but to search for suspicious figures, for imaginary strangers who might be hiding somewhere beyond the walls. She had instituted hundreds of rules for the household, all aimed at preventing these dangers from the outside. "How many times have I told you?" she snapped at a young servant girl she caught, drawing water from a well near the livestock pens. "Water from the western well is only for irrigation and washing clothes. Drinking and cooking water must be taken from the central well, and it must be boiled 3 times before use. Do you want this entire family to die from a plague because of your carelessness?" The servant girl trembled, quickly emptying the bucket and bowing her head in apology. Edith had no malicious intent. In her own mind, she was simply doing what was necessary to protect her family. But her protection had become extreme, morphing into a toxic form of control. She would often personally inspect the locks on all the doors, even the doors to the storehouses, despite knowing with certainty that there was not a single soul to be seen for miles. Her fear did not remain contained within herself. Like a poisonous fog, it slowly spread and seeped into the minds of her 2 daughters. She taught them about cleanliness to the point of obsession. She taught them about the danger of strangers, that they should never trust anyone who did not belong to their oasis. She taught them to keep their distance from everything not controlled by their parents. "Never eat strange fruit that the shepherd children offer you," she would warn them. "You don't know if it's been poisoned. Never go near the new stonemasons. They might carry diseases from the outside world." A mother's love, which should be a warm, protective embrace, had become an invisible cage, imprisoning her own children. The hands that once gently held and soothed them were now the hands that sowed fear and suspicion into their young souls. Edith wanted to protect her family from a physical death, but she was completely unaware that she was slowly killing their spirits with her relentless anxiety and her corrosive distrust of everything and everyone. The shadow of suspicion had fallen over the entire villa, turning a comfortable home into a cold fortress, and its inhabitants into prisoners of the very fears they had created. Prosperity without a higher purpose gives birth to a sweet but lethal poison: boredom. Poltith and Timna, Lot's 2 daughters, were becoming intoxicated by that very poison. They had everything that girls their age in other lands could only dream of. Their clothes were woven from the finest fabrics, their food was the most delicious, and their lives were completely unburdened by any material concern. Yet they lacked the most fundamental thing of all: a reason to wake up in the morning, a meaning to pursue. Their souls were like fertile fields, well-watered and rich, but upon which no good seeds had ever been sown. And naturally, in that neglected soil, the weeds of vanity and cruelty were beginning to grow wild. One afternoon, as the intense heat of the day began to subside, the 2 sisters sat by a man-made pool of crystal-clear water. The surface of the pool was as smooth as glass, reflecting the sky and the lazy, drifting clouds. But this peaceful beauty only served to highlight the restlessness in their hearts. Poltith, the elder sister, with raven-black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, tossed a pebble into the pool, shattering the perfect reflection. "Another day gone," she said, her voice dripping with ennui. "The sun rises, the sun sets, the sheep bleat, then they fall silent. I am sick to death of this perfection." Timna, the younger sister, who had a gentler appearance but a mischievous glint in her eye, sighed dramatically. "If only something would happen," she replied. "Anything at all. A small storm, a stray animal that wanders in, even a visitor, no matter how dirty." Their parents had given them food, clothing, and absolute security, but they had forgotten to give them a compass for life. Lot was too preoccupied with increasing his wealth, and Edith was too absorbed in her invisible fears. They did not teach their daughters about compassion, about sharing, or about the joy found in serving others. As a result, the 2 girls grew up in a gilded cage, and to escape their boredom, they began to seek stimulation, to find thrills in amusements that grew increasingly selfish and malicious. They no longer found pleasure in simple things. They needed more drama, more excitement, something that would provoke a reaction, even a negative one. What if we see if Father's new warhorse can actually jump over the wide irrigation ditch to the east? Poltith said suddenly, a wicked idea flashing in her eyes. Timna hesitated for a moment. The stable master said the ditch is too wide, that the horse could break its leg if it tried. Poltith smirked, a smile devoid of any real joy. That's what would make it interesting, she replied. Wouldn't that be dramatic? They didn't truly hate the horse, but the thought of the chaos, of seeing the adults running around in a panic, of creating an event to break the soul-crushing monotony, held an irresistible appeal. They had started with smaller things. They tormented the servants, especially the newer ones, by giving them contradictory orders, and then giggling as they watched their confusion. They wasted food, tossing the best cuts of meat to the dogs, simply because they were not in the mood to eat it. They openly mocked the religious rituals their parents performed so mechanically each day, treating them as a boring play they were forced to attend. They were dancing a desperate waltz on the very edge of an existential void. Each step, each cruel prank, took them further from innocence and closer to a cold darkness where apathy reigned. They were the products of an environment that was materially perfect but spiritually bankrupt. And the tragedy was, they were slowly becoming reflections of their parents, a father who knew only wealth and a mother who knew only fear. Within Lot's grand villa, there was a special room dedicated to worship. It was not a humble space but a formal chamber, constructed with cool marble tiles and tall windows facing east toward the rising sun. In the center of the room stood an altar carved from a single block of solid stone, intricately detailed. But upon closer inspection, one would notice a strange discrepancy. The altar was sterile, immaculately clean. There were no traces of candle wax, no lingering scent of burnt incense, and the stone surface was cold to the touch, as if a warm, prayerful hand had not rested upon it in a very long time. It looked more like a museum exhibit than a place of spiritual connection. Every evening, following a long-established routine, Lot and his family would gather here. They would stand in a straight line before the altar, with Lot in the center, a self-appointed priest for his household. But the atmosphere of the service was heavy and lifeless. "We thank you, Lord, for a peaceful day and a bountiful harvest." Lot would begin the prayer, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone, as if he were reading a daily business report. "Please continue to protect our livestock from disease and our property from the thieves who lurk in the wilderness. Amen." The family would echo the Amen disjointedly, without unity. Edith, his wife, while her husband prayed, kept her eyes darting nervously around the room, as if afraid a spider might be spinning a web in a dark corner. His two daughters stood behind their parents, exchanging subtle glances, trying to stifle yawns of boredom. For them, this was merely a mandatory procedure to be completed before the evening meal, a tedious play they had to act in every single day. Do you see it? This was no longer an intimate conversation with God. This was a transaction, a list of demands presented in exchange for performing a ritual. It was a business contract in which Lot believed he had fulfilled his part of the bargain, living a life separate from sin, and it was now God's turn to fulfill his protecting and increasing his assets. The fire of faith on the altar of their hearts had long since gone out, leaving only the cold ashes of habit. Gratitude had become a formula, and faith had been demoted to an insurance policy for their wealth. They were thankful for their riches, for their full storehouses and fat livestock, but they were no longer thankful to the one who had graciously provided it all. They had come to love the gift more than the giver, and that is the most subtle and dangerous form of idolatry. As soon as the final Amen was spoken, the facade of sanctity immediately vanished. Lot would instantly turn to his wife to discuss the need to hire more guards for the southern gate, as he had heard a rumor of a strange tribe passing through the desert several days' journey away. The daughters would quickly whisper to each other about a new prank they had devised to play on the cook, then giggle and leave the room. The prayer room and the stone altar were once again abandoned to the silence and the cold, their duty for the day complete. The greatest danger to a soul is not a loud and public denial of God, but a polite and gradual forgetting of Him. When a family stops sharing with one another their joys, their sorrows, their hopes, and their heartfelt prayers, they are no longer a family in the truest sense of the word. They are simply selfish individuals, strangers cohabiting under one luxurious roof. And that house, no matter how strong its stone walls, had already begun to crack from its spiritual foundations. A tiny fracture, but one that was growing larger with each passing day, waiting for just the right pressure to cause a complete collapse. Then, on a day of blistering midday heat, when the entire oasis seemed to be holding its breath in the still heavy air, and the ground shimmered with rising waves of heat, the test arrived. It did not come in the form of a great invading army, or a terrifying plague descending from the sky. It came quietly and humbly. It came in the form of weakness, exhaustion, and utter destitution. From the vast expanse of the desert, where mirages danced on the distant dunes, a lone figure appeared. Small, crooked, almost blending in with the yellow of the sand. It was an old man. His clothes were tattered and faded by the sun and wind, little more than rags clinging to his frame. His skin was wrinkled, sun-darkened, and cracked like the desert floor in a drought. He leaned heavily on a crude wooden staff, and each step he took seemed to be a monumental effort. His lips were parched, and his deep-set eyes were fixed on the green speck of the oasis, as if it were the last lighthouse, the only hope in an ocean of despair. He had been walking for 3 days in the desert, separated from his caravan after a sandstorm. His water and food had run out the day before. Now, all he had left was the last ounce of his strength to carry him forward. By the time the old man reached the outer stone wall of the villa, his strength was completely gone. He collapsed against the hot stone, his breathing shallow and ragged. He had no energy left to call out or knock on the gate. He simply sat there, hoping someone would see him. A young shepherd boy, leading his flock back to the pens to escape the sun, discovered him. The boy was startled by the old man's condition and ran inside to inform his master. "Master, master," he panted, as he found Lot reviewing ledgers in his cool study. "There is a stranger at the gate. He looks as if he is about to die." Lot looked up from his numbers, his brow furrowed, not with concern for the stranger, but with annoyance at being disturbed. A stranger meant an anomaly, an unknown element in the perfect system he had so painstakingly built. His first thought was not of rescue, but of risk assessment. "A stranger?" he asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "Where did he come from? Does he belong to a tribe? Is he armed?" The shepherd boy, who saw only a pitiful old man, answered hesitantly, "No, master, he is alone, and very old and weak. He has nothing but a wooden staff." Lot's first question was not, "What does he need?" but "Is he a threat?" His heart, long hardened by wealth and worry, now saw only potential danger, not a brother in need. He stood up, not out of compassion, but from the necessity of dealing with a problem that had just arisen, a disruption to his carefully managed order. He did not know that he was not just walking out to face a beggar. He was walking out to face a test sent from God himself, a test disguised in the tattered robes of an uninvited guest. The test of hospitality, the most fundamental measure of a person's humanity and faith, had officially begun, and he and his prosperous family were the ones who would have to answer. Lot stepped out from the coolness of the villa, followed by his wife, Edith, and their 2 curious daughters. The oppressive heat of midday struck them immediately, making them uncomfortable. They stopped in the inner courtyard, keeping a safe distance from the gate where the old man sat slumped against the wall, his eyes closed in exhaustion. Lot stared down at the old man with a cold, appraising gaze, as if he were inspecting livestock rather than a human being. Edith, with her obsession for cleanliness and her fear of disease, quickly lifted a thin silk scarf to cover her nose and mouth, whispering to her husband with unconcealed disgust. Poltith and Timnah hid behind their mother, pointing and whispering to each other, their eyes filled with a cruel curiosity instead of compassion. For them, this was a novel sight, an unexpected entertainment in an otherwise dull day. The old man heard their footsteps and struggled to open his eyes. The bright sunlight made him squint. He saw 4 figures standing at a distance, their forms blurry through the waves of heat rising from the ground. With what little strength he had left, he managed a weak, hoarse voice, cracked with thirst. "Please, have mercy. Just a sip of water and a bit of shade to rest. I have been walking for 3 days in the desert." His plea seemed to fall on deaf ears, failing to reach the hearts of those standing before him. "Don't go near him, my dear," Edith whispered urgently to Lot. "He looks so filthy. His clothes are in rags. What if he carries some plague from the outside? Think of our daughters." Her fear had completely overwhelmed any sense of pity. Timnah, the younger daughter, giggled and whispered to her sister, "Look at his beard. It looks like an abandoned bird's nest." Poltith stifled a laugh. They saw another's suffering as a spectacle. Lot listened to his wife, and her words only reinforced the decision already forming in his mind. He did not see a father or a grandfather in distress. He saw only a nuisance, a potential risk. He answered the old man, his voice cold and distant, devoid of any human warmth. "There is water, but we do not make it a habit to shelter strangers. Rest here for a moment, and then be on your way. This land is private property, not a resting place for vagrants." His words were like a knife, severing the old man's fragile thread of hope. Lot then motioned to a servant. The servant brought out a rough wooden bowl, the kind they used for the animals, filled it with water, and placed it harshly on the ground, several feet away from where the old man sat. It was an act of charity, not hospitality. It carried a clear message. "You are on the same level as my cattle." After performing this duty, Lot and his family turned their backs and walked back inside. The heavy oak gate was pulled shut with a long, mournful creak, then slammed into place, leaving only a small crack, just wide enough for someone to peer out. The door had been closed, not with the loud bang of anger, but with the quiet click of callous indifference. They had not thrown stones. They had not cursed him. They had simply denied him his human dignity. They gave him a little water to sustain his life, but they refused him the respect and compassion that makes life worth living. In the moment that door closed, they did not just shut out a miserable beggar, they shut out mercy itself from their hearts. They had failed the test, miserably. Outside, the old man painfully crawled to the bowl, lifted it with trembling hands, and drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin and into his matted beard. When he was finished, he looked up at the nearly sealed gate, then slowly raised his gaze to the vast, emotionless blue sky. A deep sadness, not resentment, filled his ancient eyes. He slowly got to his feet, leaning on his staff, then turned his back on the rich oasis and began to limp back into the unforgiving heat of the desert. In the moments after the old man's stooped figure disappeared behind a large sand dune, a strange change began to occur in the sky. The sky, which had been a clear and oppressively silent blue, suddenly turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow, as if a giant hand had thrown a fistful of dust across a canvas. The wind, which had been nothing more than a hot, listless breath, began to stir. At first, it was just a gentle breeze, stroking the tops of the date palms, but within minutes, it rapidly escalated, rising to a furious, howling gale, carrying a sound like the shriek of a colossal, wounded beast awakening from its slumber. The judgment of God does not always descend from the heavens in fire and brimstone. Sometimes it rises from the very ground upon which people stand, from the very things they have scorned and sought to control. The desert, the enemy Lot, had spent his life building walls against, had now come to reclaim what was its own. This was no ordinary sandstorm, the kind that desert nomads knew how to weather. This was the breath of wrath. This was the fury of a slighted nature, unleashed by the coldness of the human heart. From the horizon, gigantic walls of sand began to form, hundreds of feet high, rolling and churning with terrifying speed. They swallowed the sunlight, turning the day into a ghastly, unnatural twilight. The wind screamed through the cracks in the rocks, making mournful, wailing sounds. The proud date palms were whipped back and forth before snapping and breaking like twigs. Tiles were torn from the roof of the luxurious villa, sent spinning into the air like dry leaves. The herds of livestock, panicked and bleating pitifully, ran in circles with no direction before the waves of sand crashed over them, burying them in an instant. The irrigation channels, Lot's pride and joy, were quickly filled. The green of life was being systematically erased, replaced by the monolithic yellow of destruction. Inside the villa, Lot and his family were living their worst nightmare. They ran from room to room in absolute panic, trying to barricade the windows and doors, but it was futile. The wind slammed against the walls with such force that the entire building trembled as if it were about to collapse. Sand, as fine as flour, poured in through every crack and crevice, no matter how small. In moments, everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. The expensive Persian rugs, the polished ceramic vases, the fine wooden furniture, all of it was submerged in sand. "The granaries! Save the granaries!" Lot screamed in desperation, his voice lost in the roaring wind. "All my assets, my life's work!" He tried to run outside, but a powerful gust of wind threw him back, sending him sprawling to the floor. He was no longer the king of the oasis. He was just a helpless man in the face of nature's rage. Edith collapsed onto the floor, sobbing hysterically, her hands covering her head. "God, why? Why us?" she shrieked. "What did we do wrong? We lived a righteous life, separate from sin." She asked why, but the answer lay in the very wealth they were trying to cling to, in the very separation she was so proud of. They had turned God's gift into an idol, and now that idol was being pulverized into dust before their very eyes. The storm was not just destroying property. It was tearing out the very roots of the pride, self-satisfaction, and apathy they had nurtured for so long. The sand was not just filling their home, it was filling the emptiness in their souls with a horrifying truth. When all material things are gone, they have nothing left. The storm raged for an entire afternoon, and through a long, terrifying night. It howled, it clawed, and it consumed everything. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. As the first weak rays of dawn pierced through the hazy, dust-filled air, a dead silence descended upon the land. This silence was more terrifying than the roar of the storm. It was the silence of complete and utter devastation. When Lot and his family finally managed to force open a door jammed with sand and step outside, the scene that greeted them was worse than any nightmare. The entire oasis was gone. Their gilded promised land had been completely buried under a vast, soulless sea of pale sand. There was no more green from the fields, no sound of running water, no bleating of livestock. There was only sand, stretching to the horizon. A few splintered treetops and the jagged, broken walls of the villa were the only remaining tombstones, marking the grave of a dead paradise. Lot, Edith, and their 2 daughters, their clothes in tatters, their bodies covered in a fine layer of dust, stood stunned amidst the desolate landscape. Their wealth, their security, their pride, all of it had been taken by the storm. It had stripped them bare, both literally and figuratively, leaving only their true selves. 4 weak, frightened beings, made perfectly equal by their shared, catastrophic loss. They were no longer the master, the mistress, or the young ladies. They were simply survivors. After a long period of shock, the instinct for survival pushed them to move. They stumbled away from the wreckage of their past, walking aimlessly across the barren wasteland. After hours of walking under a sun that was beginning to grow harsh, they found a small cave in the side of a low, rocky mountain. It was dark and damp, but at that moment it was a precious sanctuary. They crawled inside, exhausted, and almost immediately collapsed onto the cold stone floor. Now, in the silence of the cave, There were no sheep to be counted, no servants to be ordered, no frivolous amusements to be pursued. There was only the sound of 4 people breathing heavily and a profound, heavy silence that enveloped them all. They sat there, no one speaking a word, each lost in their own thoughts. Lot stared at his hands. The hands that were calloused from holding a pen to his ledgers, the hands that had once held a fortune, were now pale and empty. He had lost everything. Everything he had worked for, worried over, and prayed to protect was now nothing but dust. Edith was no longer worried about disease or cleanliness. She simply trembled from cold and fear, a primal fear of the unknown. The 2 daughters, stripped of their silks and jewels, huddled together in a dark corner. For the first time in their lives, they felt real fear, not just boredom. Their arrogance had been blown away by the storm. The external destruction had forced them to confront something even more frightening, the internal emptiness of their own souls. This was the naked truth. When everything they had worshipped was taken away, what did they have left? They had each other. For the first time in years, Lot truly looked at his wife and daughters. He did not see them as parts of his estate, as possessions to be guarded. He saw them as human beings, his only companions in this disaster. Edith looked at her husband, no longer as a money-making machine, but as a broken man. The daughters looked at their parents, no longer as all-powerful protectors, but as people who were just as vulnerable and in need of comfort as they were. The silence in the cave was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of reflection. Perhaps God, through the storm, had not just taken from them. Perhaps he had given them a painful grace, the chance to strip away all the meaningless things that had cluttered their hearts, so that they could rediscover what truly mattered. The darkness in the cave slowly receded as dawn broke. The first rays of sunlight, clean and pure after the storm, streamed through the cave entrance, bathing the space in a golden light and chasing away the chill of the night. The light did not just illuminate the world outside, it seemed to be trying to penetrate the darkest corners of the souls of the 4 people within. Lot slowly pushed himself to his feet. His body ached, but within him a strange transformation was taking place. He walked to the mouth of the cave and looked out at the wasteland that had once been his kingdom. The sea of sand stretched to infinity, shimmering under the morning sun. There was no more frantic regret or helpless anger in his eyes, only a quiet and profound acceptance. Destruction sometimes is not an end, but a beginning, a painful and necessary rebirth. The desert had taken their oasis, their wealth, their pride, and their false sense of security, but in return, it had given them a priceless gift, a second chance, a chance to start over from nothing, a chance to rebuild a life, not on a foundation of sand and riches that could be blown away in an instant, but on a different foundation, one that was invisible but far more enduring. Edith and her 2 daughters followed him out, standing beside him. They had not slept, but their exhaustion seemed to have been washed away by the silence of the night and the freshness of the morning. They stood together, looking toward the horizon where the sun was slowly rising, brilliant and full of promise. For the first time in a very long time, they were truly standing together as a family, sharing a single moment, looking in the same direction. "We have lost everything," Lot said, his voice no longer commanding or calculating, but soft and trembling slightly. It was not a lament, but a confession, an acknowledgement of the truth. Edith turned to look at her husband. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they were not tears of despair, but of clarity. She gently shook her head and reached out to take Lot's calloused hand. "No," she said, her voice clear. "We still have each other." In that moment, something was mended. An invisible crack was filled. The 2 daughters remained silent, but they moved closer, pressing against their parents, seeking and offering warmth. Poltith, the elder daughter who had always been so cynical and aloof, quietly rested her head on her mother's shoulder. That small gesture spoke more than any words could. Lot took a deep breath of the clean desert air, then turned to his wife and daughters. a weary but genuine smile appearing on his lips for the first time in years. "Then," he said, "let us begin again." Lot and his family were given a cave and a dawn, a clear choice between drowning in the despair of the past or walking bravely toward the hope of the future. Their story, my friends, is not just an ancient legend about judgment. It is a mirror, a profound reminder for every one of us living in this modern age. Take a moment to look at your own oasis. Could be the career you have painstakingly built, the family you love, or the material comforts you enjoy. Ask your heart, is it slowly becoming a fortress of convenience, a gilded prison that separates you from sincere gratitude and unconditional love? Is the altar in your heart growing cold, and are your prayers becoming a list of demands? The final scene is of four small figures, holding hands, beginning their journey toward the rising sun. They have nothing in their hands, but they have everything they need. They have each other, and they have a new chance. They are walking across a vast wasteland, but that wasteland is no longer a symbol of death. It is an open, light-filled space where they can find themselves and find God once more. Because in the end, the most terrifying judgment is not the storm that comes from without, but the dead silence of a heart that has ceased to love from within. But the good news is, the dawn always follows the storm, and the door of mercy is never completely closed. The final question for each of us is, are you brave enough to walk through it?